Dear friends, to commemorate the centenary of the First World War and the 75th anniversary of the Second World War, the world has united in honouring and remembering all who fought and all of those who fell during the darkest parts of our world's history. Their stories will never be forgotten. They live on, not through literature or photography as one might expect, but through our steam engines. Locomotives and their crews are so easily forgotten, yet without their courage, resilience and undying determination to keep the country and the war effort moving, victory could not have been achieved. This is their story. One morning, Edward stood dozing in the yards. He had been shunting from the early hours and was catching up on some sleep. Just then, some cleaners arrived. They were 3 young boys who had started work on the railway. Their names were John, Peter, and Charlie. Edward was very fond of them. They were very attentive and enjoyed talking to Edward. They worked hard too, and always kept Edward in pristine condition. "You're far too grand to be shunting trucks," they would always say. "If I thought that, I'd be as obnoxious as the bigger engines," teased Edward. Over the coming weeks, the boys earned their crust and cleaned all of the engines, but Edward was their favourite. "When I'm older, I'm going to be an engine driver," said Charlie, "and you'll be my engine I always take out." Edward smiled. "That's very kind of you, Charlie. I hope I'm still running by then." "Of course you will," reassured Charlie, "and that's a promise." Whilst Charlie enjoyed his work, John and Peter grew tired and restless. Their enthusiasm lessened each day, and like young boys they could think of nothing else than achieving higher aspirations and accomplishing their dreams. "Oh, there must be more to life than cleaning engines," sighed John. Peter agreed. "I'm bored. I don't want to be stuck on this island all my life. I want to see the world." "We always knew it would be a slow process to work our way up from cleaning," cut in Charlie. "Yeah, but I'll be old and grey by the time I reach being a driver," scoffed John. "I want an adventure whilst I'm still young." Unbeknown to the 3 boys, the prospect of an adventure was about to occur. In 1914, Britain had declared war on Germany. Men from all across the country went to sign up and fight for their country. John and Peter took this as the answer to their prayers. They saw this as a perfect opportunity for an adventure. But Charlie was more reserved. He wasn't keen on enlisting. He was happy enough working on the railway. The 3 boys had an argument in front of Edward. "If you don't join, everyone will think that you are a coward," snorted John. "I'm not a coward," exclaimed Charlie indignantly. "Then prove 'em wrong. Show 'em how much of a man you are," huffed Peter. "I am a man, but I don't need to join the army to prove it." "You're soft. Leave him alone," interrupted Edward. "There's no cause to be rude to your friend." John and Peter subsided. "I enjoy working on the railway. I'm happy as I am," insisted Charlie. "But there is more out there that we haven't seen or done. Oh, come on. Come with us, Charlie. Live your life while you're still young," pleaded John. "The railway will always be here." Charlie paused for a moment. He looked at his friends. He then looked at Edward. The engine's face seemed nervous and worried. Charlie then took a deep breath and agreed to join the army with his friends. The boys cheered excitedly. Edward couldn't bring himself to share in the celebrations. As soon as the 3 boys enlisted, they were taken away for training. Edward never saw them in the yards again. When the day came for them to leave, Edward was on duty with the passenger train at the big station. John and Peter were far too excited and proudly paced the platform in their uniforms. Charlie, however, came to say goodbye to Edward. "You promise you'll be safe?" asked Edward. "I promise," smiled Charlie. "And you promise to come back too?" "Of course, old boy. I promise, and I'll be back and driving you in no time." Edward felt guiltfully doubtful. he watched as Charlie rejoined his friends and comrades as they boarded the train. None of them had any idea what lay beyond the English Channel, waiting for them. It soon became a familiar sight for Edward. Day after day he watched troop trains packed with young men depart the big station, their faces all filled with naive excitement and anticipation. Edward had no clue what unspeakable abominations were happening in France, but what he did know was that war was nothing to be excited about. Military trains soon became the main part of day-to-day life of the engines, and soon, to help them with their ordinary tasks, engines from the London North Western Railway and the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway came to help. One of these engines spoke to Edward as another troop train was preparing to depart. "Know anyone on that train?" he asked quietly. "No, but I did know 3 boys who left a couple of weeks ago," replied Edward. The engine paused sadly. "They won't be coming back," he murmured. "How dare you say such a thing?" snorted Edward. "It's the truth," quivered the engine. The trains always return empty, and the ones that do come back aren't men anymore. They're just broken, beyond repair." Edward's face began to turn pale. "They've seen things we can't imagine. They'll never be the same again. This is the war to end all wars." Edward lost his voice in disbelief as the troop train steamed out of the big station. Time went slowly by. The thought of Charlie, John and Peter never returning tormented Edward. The fat director had noticed this and spoke kindly to Edward. "One can be forgiven for becoming distracted in a time like this," said the fat director. "I cannot bring you comfort in informing you the 3 young boys' whereabouts, but I can offer you the opportunity to help first hand with the war effort." "Yes, sir, please, sir, I would gladly help, sir," insisted Edward eagerly. "There's a good engine. I would like you to be in charge of our newly commissioned ambulance train. Unfortunately, so great are the numbers of wounded soldiers needing to be evacuated from the battlefields that we have been asked by the government to build a mobile hospital to bring them quickly and safely home. I'll bring each and every one home until my wheels have fallen off and I'm worn into the rails," puffed Edward with feeling. The fat director smiled proudly at Edward. "I knew I could rely on you, but I must warn you, what you may see when heading this train may shock and upset you. Do not be ashamed to ask for a respite should it become too much." Edward completely understood. The fat director turned and walked slowly away. Edward immediately found being assigned to the ambulance train was a hard job. The trains were long, and so too was the journey. Each time he left the big station and headed towards Southampton to collect the wounded soldiers that were being brought in by their thousands by ships. So severe were the casualties that other ambulance trains heading to the island of Sodor had to be organised. Edward would take half to the hospitals, whilst other engines from different railways would take them to Ballyhoo Manor, which had been commandeered by the military. The sights Edward saw were so horrific, he was sure they would live with him forever. Line after line after line of seriously injured men laying on stretchers along the dockside for as far as the eye could see. What seemed like an outnumbered array of nurses attending and treating an entire army shocked Edward. He was beyond words when all he could hear from inside his train were men screaming in sheer terror from being shell-shocked from the trenches. This went on and on for weeks, until one day at Southampton docks, Edward overheard a doctor talking to a nurse. "There's a young boy who's in bad shape," he said. "What is his name?" she asked. "Charlie Sand." Edward gasped. "Charlie!" he shrieked. He saw the sight of an unconscious boy being carried onto the train. "Hold on, Charlie. I'll get you home. That's a promise," called Edward. The guard blew his whistle, and Edward hurried out of the docks. Edward flew along the main line. "Hurry, hurry, hurry," panted Edward to the coaches. "We must save Charlie, we must save Charlie. As fast as you can, as fast as you can," encouraged the coaches. Engines were quickly diverted into sidings and goods loops to let Edward race by, each one whistling and willing Edward on. Faster and faster he went, until at last he arrived back on Sodor, and the hospital finally came into view. "I hope we're not too late," cried Edward. The casualties were quickly unloaded and ushered away into the hospital. After that, Edward never saw Charlie again. He had no idea if Charlie had survived. Years went by. The Great War had ended, but Edward was now fighting a battle of his own. He had been informed of what became of John and Peter. John was killed in no man's land, and Peter went missing, presumed dead. Edward felt a great deal of sorrow for the two boys. Like so many, they had their whole lives ahead of them, only to have it snatched away with the merciless and cruel force that is war. But no one knew what happened to Charlie. He seemed to just disappear. Edward was most upset by this. He didn't want to admit it, but he was sure he had died. Worse still was that Edward was once again being employed on secondary duties and was rarely venturing out of the shed. More bigger and powerful engines were taking over most of his trains, and there were fears that Edward could be scrapped. What Edward didn't know was Charlie had survived. His physical health returned, but his mental health had been affected greatly. He moved away to Carlisle, where in time he grew better and once again joined the railway as a cleaner to reach his ambition as a driver. He did so, and many years later he returned to Sodor to work as a driver for the North Western Railway. On his first day, he saw Edward looking very sad in the shed. "The driver won't choose you again," boasted Gordon. "He wants strong engines like us." Charlie looked at Edward. "Would you like to come out today?" he asked. "Oh yes, please," said Edward happily. So the fireman lit his fire, made lots of steam, and Edward was ready to leave. Charlie winked at Edward. "I told you I'd promised to take you out." Edward thought for a moment. Then he suddenly realized who his driver was. "Charlie!" puffed Edward, astonished. "Hi, Edward, it's me. I know you'll be here waiting for me. Now, let's show these big engines what you can do." "Yes, sir," beamed Edward. Edward puffed happily away. The other engines were very cross at being left behind. Charlie kept true to his word. He is now Edward's driver and takes him out every day. This, in turn, saved Edward. The two are inseparable, but do not talk about what they saw during the war, the scars of which run too deep, and neither want to reminisce about the part of their dark past. Both served their country and answered the call of duty, but both will always remember the day when an engine saved his driver and a driver saved his engine.